August 5th, 1962. A late-model Austin Westminster snakes through the hills outside Howick, South Africa. Inside, Nelson Mandela sits in the driver's seat, disguised as a chauffeur in a long duster coat. He's been underground for nearly 2 years, South Africa's most wanted man. Just days before, he'd returned from a secret tour across Africa, raising money for an armed struggle he now leads. A Soviet Makarov pistol sits between the seats. The road narrows. A Ford V8 pulls in front. Mandela sees the roadblock instantly. In that moment, he'll later to tell friends, he considered rolling out the door, throwing himself down the embankment. He was fit enough, but the logic of a hunted man, the mathematics of survival, held him still. There were cars behind him now, guns. The moment was over before it began. A tall, lean policeman approaches. He's never met Mandela, never seen his face. Yet when he peers into that car, he says only one thing. "You are Nelson Mandela, and I am arresting you." The question that will haunt historians for decades hangs in that pause. How did they know? Welcome to Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened, the podcast where we look what is behind well-known stories and myths. I'm your host, and in this episode, we're going to investigate one of the 20th century's most consequential men and the people who betrayed him. We're not here to reduce Nelson Mandela to a villain. Rather, we're going to look unflinching at a historical truth, that betrayal, both from without and within, shaped his life in ways most biographies gloss over. And perhaps more importantly, how Mandela himself chose to respond when betrayed. Betrayal, for our purposes, is clear: a breach of trust, a breaking of law, agreement, or the bonds that hold movements together. In the next 30 minutes, we'll answer 3 questions. Who betrayed Nelson Mandela? Who did Mandela and his closest allies betray? And what did those betrayals cost? The stakes are global, because how Mandela responded to betrayal became a blueprint for post-conflict nations around the world. To understand betrayal, you first need to understand the hunted man. By August 1962, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was 44 years old. He'd spent nearly 20 years climbing through the ANC, African National Congress, from law student to national organizer. He'd marched in the 1952 defiance campaign that swelled ANC membership from approximately 7,000 to 100,000 members. He'd narrowly escaped conviction in the treason trial of 1956. But after police opened fire on unarmed protesters at Sharpeville in March 1960, killing 69 people, Mandela had drawn a conclusion that would remake his life. Nonviolence alone could not defeat apartheid. With Walter Sisulu and Joe Slovo, Mandela co-founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, abbreviated MK, the Spear of the Nation, in 1961. The organization was nominally separate from the ANC to protect the party's reputation. In reality, Mandela was its military architect. By 1962, he was the face of armed resistance in South Africa. Western intelligence agencies watched him obsessively. American analysts labeled him a probable communist and a threat to strategic mineral supplies. Soviet archives later confirmed that Mandela had indeed joined the South African Communist Party in the late 1950s or early 1960s, though he would deny this publicly for decades, fearing it would undermine the ANC's multiracial message. Here's what Western governments feared most. Mandela was effective. MK's sabotage campaign in December 1961 had electrified the anti-apartheid movement. South Africa's white minority government, supported by American and British allies, understood that Mandela had to be stopped. And so, in February 1962, the American intelligence apparatus began tracking him in earnest. This chapter answers, how did a foreign spy service conspire to capture Mandela, and what documents prove it? In May 1961, more than a year before Mandela's arrest, the CIA produced an intelligence memo marked Secret. Declassified in 2017, this document describes Mandela as a probable communist who has revitalized the Congress movement. He is, the analysts conclude, an able organizer who reportedly has ample funds at his disposal. Then, in February 1962, just months before his capture, another CIA memo, also marked secret, pinpoints Mandela as the head of the ANC's guerrilla movement and reveals the agency's awareness that he was no longer in South Africa. Mandela, who lived undercover in South Africa in Basutoland after the failure of the general strike he called last May, has left the country. The rest of the sentence is blacked out. The CIA was tracking him. By early 1962, America's intelligence community had a choice. They could observe and report, or they could act. In Durban, South Africa, an American diplomat operated undercover as a vice consul. His name was Donald Rickard. According to the South African Star newspaper in 1986, reporting on interviews with a retired senior police officer, Rickard was the CIA operative for that region. In 2016, when Rickard was 88 years old and dying, he finally broke his silence in an interview with British filmmaker John Irvin. Rickard confirmed he had been a State Department undercover operative. He described Durban as a cauldron of anti-apartheid activity. The ANC was organizing the city's substantial Indian population. Something had to be done. Here's what Rickard told Irvin in that interview. I found when Mandela was coming down and how he was coming, and he came in a black limousine with a guy sitting in the back as the passenger, and he was the driver. That's where I was involved, and that's where Mandela was caught. Rickard was being imprecise about the vehicle. It was an Austin Westminster, not a limousine, but the intent was unmistakable. Rickard had informed the South African police of Mandela's whereabouts on that August road. The details match: time of travel, location, even the cover story Mandela was using. And Rickard had no regrets. Mandela was completely under the control of the Soviet Union, he said. He was a toy of Moscow. Rickard believed he had prevented a Soviet takeover of southern Africa. In the Cold War arithmetic of American intelligence, one imprisoned freedom fighter was a small price for American strategic interests. Rickard died 2 weeks after his confession. His only regret was that he'd been indiscreet at a party years earlier, blabbing about CIA actions while drunk. The demotion that followed, he said, was the biggest mistake of my life. Not because he'd betrayed Mandela, because he'd embarrassed his agency. When Richard Stengel, who later ghostwrote Mandela's autobiography Long Walk to Freedom, asked Mandela directly in 1993 whether he suspected CIA involvement, Mandela's answer was pragmatic and characteristically without bitterness. I don't think so. I have no evidence either way. I didn't even inquire. For Mandela, the why didn't matter anymore. He was under arrest. The battle had moved to a different arena, but for history, it matters profoundly. The first betrayal was systemic. A Cold War superpower had conspired with a racist regime to imprison a man whose only crime was seeking equality. This chapter answers, how did Nelson Mandela's marriage become a betrayal of the very movement he was dying for? 27 years passed. Mandela sat in a prison cell the size of a closet on Robben Island. His hands grew calloused from breaking limestone in quarries. His eyes dimmed from the glare. His first wife, Evelyn, had divorced him in 1958, unable to bear a husband consumed by politics. His second wife, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, became the face of the anti-apartheid movement on the outside, the woman who would not let the world forget Nelson. When he was finally released on February 11, 1990, Winnie stood beside him, holding his hand as crowds roared. The international media lionized her. But within weeks, rumors began to circulate in Soweto. Something was wrong in the Mandela household. In 1986, while Nelson remained in prison, Winnie had established what was called the Mandela United Football Club. Officially, it was a youth soccer team. In reality, it was a militia, young men, mostly unemployed and angry, who lived in the back rooms of her house in Soweto. They wore matching tracksuits. They carried weapons. Their job was to identify, interrogate, and eliminate suspected police informants. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the body established to investigate apartheid-era crimes after Mandela became president, would later conclude that the Mandela United Football Club was responsible for at least 17 murders, numerous kidnappings, and widespread torture between 1986 and 1989. One victim stands out in historical memory, Stompie Saipai. On December the 29th, 1988, 4 youths were kidnapped from a Methodist church manse in Soweto. They were accused of being sexually abused and of being police informants. One of them, a 14-year-old named Moeketsi Stompy Saipe, was singled out for special brutality. According to testimony given to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Stompy was beaten for hours at Winnie's house in Depkloof. His assailants included Jerry Richardson, the coach of the football club, and other members of Winnie's household. One witness, Katiza Sebekulu, testified under oath that he saw Winnie herself participating in the beatings. In early January 1989, Stompy's decomposed body was found in a riverbed. His body and head were riddled with injuries. He'd been stabbed 3 times in the neck. Months later, in May 1991, a South African court found Winnie guilty of kidnapping and being an accessory to assault in connection with Stompy's abduction. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison. On appeal, that was reduced to a 2-year suspended sentence. But here's where the betrayal cuts deepest. Jerry Richardson, the man who admitted to killing Stompy Saipe, was a police informant. He was working for the apartheid regime all along. He had been infiltrating the Mandela United Football Club, reporting to his security police handler, even as he participated in murders supposedly committed in the name of the anti-apartheid struggle. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, made public in 1998, concluded that Winnie bore political and moral responsibility for the violence. She had created the militia. She had sanctioned the killings. She had publicly slandered the Reverend Paul Veron, the priest at the Methodist Manse, falsely accusing him of sexually abusing the youths to divert attention from her own role. When Mandela learned the full extent of Winnie's crimes, detailed in TRC testimonies, he faced an excruciating choice. He could protect his wife, or he could accept the verdict of history. On April 13, 1992, Mandela publicly announced his separation from Winnie. The second betrayal came from inside his own home. The woman who had stood by him during his imprisonment had, while he was in prison, become the very thing the anti-apartheid movement claimed to oppose, a tyrant who used violence to silence opponents. What makes this betrayal historically unique is that Mandela, a man who had every right to rage, chose instead to grieve. In his autobiography, he would write of his marriage with unflinching honesty. He did not divorce Winnie publicly to humiliate her, but because the movement demanded accountability. And that leads us to perhaps the deepest betrayal of all. This chapter answers, how did the liberation movement betray the very fighters who had sacrificed everything? When apartheid ended in 1994, South Africa erupted in celebration. Mandela became president. International sanctions were lifted. The world watched as a nation transformed itself. But for the men and women who had fought in MK, the armed wing that Mandela had helped found, the transition brought not liberation, but abandonment. The O'Malley Archives, a repository of oral histories conducted with South African struggle veterans, captured the bitter testimonies of former soldiers. Here are their words, recorded in the late 1990s and early 2000s. You'll notice that our cadres are suffering more than everybody in the country. They should have been the first preference of this government. But the government of the ANC, it has thrown us away. Another veteran, this thing that the ANC has done to us has destroyed us. For such a long time we were working for the ANC, but the ANC has thrown us outside like morning mucus. A third, we are still suffering. We are still the same. We are unemployed. What happened? When Mandela took office in 1994, South Africa's economy was in crisis. The apartheid government had squandered resources. International investors were hesitant. The new ANC government faced a choice: pursue radical economic transformation, nationalize mines, redistribute land aggressively, redistribute wealth, or adopt a more market-friendly, cautious approach. Mandela chose caution. Under the influence of advisors like Thabo Mbeki and facing pressure from international financial institutions and Western investors who feared a communist takeover, Mandela's government abandoned the radical transformation promised during the struggle. Land reform was minimal. Healthcare expansion was gradual. And the former soldiers of MK, many of whom had sacrificed limbs, sanity, and decades of their lives, were largely abandoned. MK suspended its armed struggle in August 1990. When Mandela took office in 1994, MK forces were integrated into the new South African National Defense Force, but the process was deeply flawed. Of thousands MK members slated for integration, many were rejected or left behind. Veterans were offered small stipends. Many remained unemployed. By the late 1990s, suicide rates among former MK combatants were climbing. The third betrayal was ideological. The man who had spent 27 years in prison fighting for a classless society emerged to build a society where black capitalists and white business elites shared power, while the soldiers who had fought for him starved. Is this a fair characterization? It depends on your perspective. Mandela himself would argue, and many scholars agree, that radical transformation would have sparked civil war, capital flight, and economic collapse. The compromise was tragic, but necessary. Yet to the veterans, there was no sophisticated argument, no Cold War context, no economic necessity that mattered. There was only the simple truth. They had been promised freedom, and instead they were forgotten. This contradiction between Mandela the revolutionary and Mandela the pragmatist defines his presidency, and it leads directly to our fourth betrayal. This chapter answers: how did Mandela's choice to forgive perpetrators without requiring remorse betray the victims of apartheid? In 1995, Mandela signed the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act. It established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC. Rather than relying primarily on prosecutions, perpetrators could confess their crimes publicly in exchange for amnesty under specific conditions. The logic was elegant: truth instead of justice, testimony instead of trials, healing instead of revenge. Over the next 3 years, the TRC held public hearings across South Africa. Thousands testified. Some perpetrators wept. Some showed no remorse whatsoever. The numbers are stark. The TRC received 7,112 amnesty applications. It granted amnesty to 849 applicants. In other words, only 12% of those who applied for amnesty were approved. But that 12% encompassed many of apartheid's most notorious killers. Here's the critical fact. Remorse and repentance were not requirements for amnesty. According to the TRC's founding legislation, amnesty required only 3 things. 1, the crime had to be politically motivated. 2, the applicant had to give full disclosure. And 3, the deed had to be proportionate. A apartheid death squad member could walk into a hearing, describe in clinical detail how he tortured and murdered a political prisoner, show no regret, and walk out with a certificate of amnesty, legally protected from prosecution. Some did exactly that. From the perspective of victims' families, this was not reconciliation. It was impunity dressed up as forgiveness. Listen to the words of South African scholar E. Barron, writing in the 2015. The fact that remorse and repentance were not required in order for perpetrators to get amnesty left the reconciliation process in a vacuum. If the core aims of the TRC were reconciliation and forgiveness, is it not vital to also include remorse and repentance as part of restoring victim-perpetrator relationships? The TRC granted amnesty to 849 people. The TRC also identified thousands of victims and recommended reparations. Later, the South African government approved a once-off individual grant of $30,000 for eligible victims paid through the President's Fund. Many still walked away feeling that they had been asked to forgive in order to spare their nation from chaos. Some said openly that they had been forced to forgive, not because they wanted to, but because they were told it was necessary for the nation to heal. The fourth betrayal was philosophical. Mandela's choice to prioritize reconciliation over justice meant that victims had to swallow their pain in the name of national unity. Was Mandela wrong? That's not the question we're asking here. The question is, what did his choice cost? Let's step back. We've identified 4 betrayals: the CIA's conspiracy to capture Mandela, Winnie's descent into tyranny while her husband rotted in prison, the ANC's abandonment of its own fighters after liberation, and the TRC's choice of truth over justice. But here's what makes Nelson Mandela's legacy so vital, even in the face of these betrayals. He chose to respond to betrayal not with rage, but with clarity. When police arrested him on that road in August 1962, Mandela later said he had no hard feelings. America had been pursuing its Cold War interests. That was what powers did. He was a realist about the world. When he learned the full extent of Winnie's crimes, he separated from her, not to punish her, but to preserve the movement's moral authority. He knew that if he protected her, the anti-apartheid struggle itself would be tainted. When he left office in 1999, after serving one 5-year term, he did not cling to power. Even though many urged him to run for re-election, he stepped aside. In most of the world, authoritarian leaders do the opposite. They use their office to cement power, to enrich themselves, to silence critics. Mandela did none of this. As for the TRC, Mandela understood that perfect justice was impossible. You cannot try millions of people. You cannot undo decades of torture. You cannot bring the dead back to life. So you offer something else, the truth. Public testimony, acknowledgement of what happened. Was it adequate? History will debate that. But it was, in Mandela's view, the best humanity could do under the circumstances. There's a concept in Mandela's native Xhosa language, Ubuntu. It means, I am because we are. It means that human dignity is bound up in community, in relationship, in the willingness to see the humanity in others. Mandela, when speaking about the ANC's own violence during the struggle, attacks that killed civilians, that maimed innocents, said he did not excuse those actions, but he also did not believe that dwelling on them, seeking perpetual revenge, would help South Africa heal. Your duty is to work with human beings because they are human beings, Mandela told interviewer Richard Stengel in 1993, not because you think they are angels. Here's something important that most history textbooks miss. Mandela was betrayed not once or twice, but continuously, and yet he did not become a tyrant himself. That is the rarest achievement in human history. Let's recap what we have learned in this episode. Over the past 20 minutes, we've followed Nelson Mandela through 4 distinct betrayals. First, a superpower conspired with a racist regime to imprison him, an act of Cold War realpolitik that cost him 27 years of his life. Second, his own wife, while he was imprisoned, became a perpetrator of the very violence he was fighting against, creating a militia that tortured and murdered in the name of liberation. Third, the movement he helped found abandoned its own fighters after victory, leaving veterans homeless and unemployed while black capitalists and white business elites shared power. And fourth, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission prioritized reconciliation over justice, asking victims to forgive perpetrators who showed no remorse. Yet Mandela responded to each of these betrayals not with violence, not with revenge, but with a clear-eyed assessment of what was possible, what was necessary, and what was right. The question that haunts us, even today, is whether he was right. Was forgiveness without justice truly what South Africa needed? Should the MK veterans have been compensated more generously? Should the ANC have pursued radical economic transformation? Should Mandela have been more vengeful toward the perpetrators? These are questions each of us must answer for ourselves. But what is undeniable is this. Nelson Mandela chose to break the cycle of betrayal and revenge. In a world where betrayed men become tyrants, Mandela became a Democrat. For more on Nelson Mandela's life, I recommend Long Walk to Freedom, his autobiography, and Richard Stengel's recent work, Mandela, The Lost Tapes. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report is available online and is essential reading for anyone interested in post-conflict reconciliation. And if you're interested in the declassified CIA documents related to Mandela's arrest, Time magazine's investigation, reported by Rick Stengel in 2023, is the definitive source. If you found this episode valuable, please follow the podcast, leave a review, and share it with someone who's interested in how great men respond to betrayal. In the next episode, we're diving into the life of Joan of Arc, a patron saint of France, defender of the French nation, captured by people of her own nation and sold to England, where she was put on trial. Until then, remember, history is not just what happened. History is what we choose to do about it.